Have you noticed that most horror movies start off with either completely ordinary or cute scenes? Everyone around looks happy. The children are playing in the street. There's cheerful music in the background. Our story begins exactly the same, but it happened in reality. In the small town of Villisca, Iowa, there lived a little over 2,000 inhabitants. Among them, the well-known and wealthy Moore family stood out. The 43-year-old head of the family, Josiah Joe, and his wife, 39-year-old Sarah Moore, were well-respected people. Therefore, many people naturally envied them. By 1912, the couple had 4 children, 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul. On the morning of June 9th, they were helping their mother in the local Presbyterian church, although the sermons for the Children's Day had been prepared much earlier. Led by Sarah, these activities began in the afternoon and lasted until about 9 p.m., after which the Moore family went home. There were now already 6 children with the adults. 2 local girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, had asked their parents if they could stay the night over at the Moores' place. The girls were 12 and 8 years old. Before going to bed, the children had some milk and cookies. If they had known what was to happen that night, they would have run away from the house. None of those in that rich white household ever woke up again, save for little Lena, who met her death awake, face to face. The next morning, one of the neighbors noticed a suspicious silence in the Moores' courtyard. They were usually already awake and on their feet by 7 in the morning. She asked her brother to check if everything was all right. He looked into the window of the bedroom on the first floor and saw 2 bodies in the bed, covered with a blanket, which had a head on it, and bloodstains darkening the fabric. An hour later, Hank was at the Moores' house. This was Henry Hank Horton. The policeman quickly inspected the rooms in the building and concluded that the people were killed each in their own bed. Dr. F.S. Williams arrived at the scene of the crime, and the house was soon surrounded by a crowd of local residents. After examining the bodies, the doctor said, "Don't go there. You will regret it for the rest of your life." Nothing could have aroused the interest of the locals more than this. People entered the house and trampled onto the crime scene, but the doctor was right. Absolutely no one could forget what they saw there. There were notches on the ceiling of the upstairs bedrooms. These were left there by the axe with which the killer smashed the heads of his victims. He struck every person 20 to 30 times, both the parents and the children. Then he covered them with bed linen and went down to the first floor. The Stillinger girls, who were visiting the Moores, had been sleeping there. In their room, a bloody, slightly worn axe was leaning against the wall, and next to it lay a huge piece of raw bacon pulled out of the refrigerator. There was a plate of half-eaten food and a bowl of bloody water in the kitchen. The chest of drawers had been gone through. The killer took some clothes from there, with which he hung the windows of the front doors and all the mirrors in the house. As he left, he also grabbed the keys and locked the door behind him. Examination of both the bodies and the destroyed crime scene rendered the following information. The murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. The criminal had picked up the axe in the backyard of the owners of the house. He hid in the attic, as evidenced by cigarette butts found there. The killer then took an oil lamp with him to move around the house at night. First, he killed Josiah and Sarah. The criminal struck the man with the axe blade. In the other cases, he used the blunt end. This may indicate that the head of the house was the killer's primary target. There was blood on Lena Stillinger's knee, and her shirt was pulled up. Examination of the body showed that the girl had not been subjected to any sexual violence. Presumably, she was the only one among the 8 victims who had met her death in a conscious state, as opposed to still being asleep. On June 12th, the National Guard blocked off the streets of Villisca. Thousands of local residents followed the hearse and the funeral cortege of 50 carriages, and so passed the memorial service for the 8 victims of this terrible crime. For the police, the capture of the criminal had become a matter of honor. Not long after, the investigating party had a suspect. On the morning of June 9th, the Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly had come to town. The priest attended the Children's Day Sunday School performance, and early on Monday, he was on his way westward on train number 5. Kelly allegedly told fellow travelers that Villisca had killed 8 souls in their beds. But the man got on the train a little later than 5 in the morning, when no one but the killer knew about the crime. Further on, the situation developed even more strangely. 2 weeks later, Kelly returned to town and introduced himself as a detective. Thus, he ended up in the group of investigators who were working on the case and examining the Moore house. Perhaps this masquerade would have gone unnoticed, but Detective Kelly wrote multiple letters addressed to the police and relatives of the victims. This increased interest in the case and ultimately drew attention to the Reverend. A private detective began to answer his letters. He asked Kelly to tell him everything he knew about the murder, to which he received extremely detailed descriptions of the crime scene. After that, the police began to make inquiries about the man, and for good reason. It turned out that even in adolescence, Kelly had mental disorders. He was born in England, but moved to America, where he began to preach in Methodist churches. The Reverend traveled to North Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, and Iowa. In several communities near Villisca, residents immediately noted his strange behavior. The police decided not to take seriously the stories given by the mentally unstable Kelly. But when he was arrested in 1914 for sending obscene material through the mail, the Reverend again fell under suspicion. At first, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital, and then in 1917 he was arrested and accused of the murder of Lena Stillinger. All summer, Kelly was interrogated, and as a result, he confessed to his deed. The man claimed that God told him, "Suffer the children to come unto me." When his case came to trial, the Reverend had already retracted his confession. The jury was deadlocked. As a result, after 2 separate trials, Kelly was acquitted. A local businessman named Frank F. Jones, who had his own scores with Josiah, also came under suspicion. Initially, Moore was his employee, but then he started his own business and soon managed to get a large part of Jones's clientele. There were also rumors in the town that Josiah had a secret relationship with his sister-in-law. Even if the businessman wanted to kill his competitor, this still does not explain the brutal massacre of the 6 children and his wife. But what if the murders in Villisca were the work of a serial killer? All over the Midwest, in 1911 to 1912, there were similar crimes recorded. The axe also became the murder weapon of choice, and there were some rather strange details in these cases. One of the suspects was also of the name Moore, Henry Lee Moore. He was arrested a few months after the incident in Villisca. Wielding an axe, the man killed his own mother and grandmother. Other striking similarities to the Moore case have also been reported. Officer McClowry found 22 more similar murders in Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois. He was certain that it was Henry Lee Moore who was guilty of these crimes, but he was unable to prove it. As a result, the man spent 36 years in prison, although he was sentenced to life. He was later released on parole in 1949. McClowry was convinced that the Moore's namesake was responsible for the Villisca murders. At the same time, other investigators claimed that this was the work of a serial killer from Illinois named William Mansfield. In 1914, he killed his wife, daughter, and mother-in-law. The criminal covered the windows in the house with sheets and did away with the family using an axe. Investigators have found a connection between Mansfield and several other murders in Kansas, Colorado, and New Orleans. Further investigation determined that William was in nearby Illinois at the time of the Moore family and Stillinger's sister's murder. There was even a witness who claimed to have seen Mansfield at the railway station 20 minutes from Villisca. His involvement in other crimes has not yet been proven, but many detectives and independent researchers believe that at the time a serial killer with an axe was really operating in America. A certain Rachel McCarthy James, together with her father Bill James, even wrote a book about it. They did a massive study looking at similar murders across the country. An immigrant from Germany named Paul Mueller, who was moonlighting as a lumberjack, is allegedly guilty of these crimes. The man's name is associated with the murder of a family in Massachusetts. But in his book, James suspects him of the massacre of 59 people from 14 different families. And if one digs even deeper, then there may be 94 more victims on the conscience of this killer. All of these crimes took place over 100 years ago. Considering how the investigations were conducted then, there is very little chance of finding out the truth now. However, there is one indisputable fact. There were a lot of similar murders over the course of several years, a frightening amount of them. It's likely that the Wayne family from Colorado Springs became the first victims of the serial killer. In September 1911, a couple and their child were killed in their own beds. Mrs. A.J. Burnham and her 2 children were also killed just after them. The weapon left at the crime scene was an axe. The murderer covered the curtains with bedspreads and the heads of the dead with bed linen. In one of the houses, he also washed his hands and in both cases locked the doors behind him. Before the murder in Villisca, a similar terrible fate befell a family from Illinois, then 7 more people in Kansas. The maniac traveled around the country, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Today, the Moore house has been turned into a museum. For the 100th anniversary of the murder of its inhabitants, a video tour has even been created. And even earlier than that, the film Villisca, Living with a Mystery, was released. Material for the film was collected over 10 years. It combined old photos and computer graphics, some reconstructions, and interviews with eyewitnesses and experts. In 2017, a horror film appeared on Netflix based on the story of the brutal murder of the family, although the truth is much more frightening since it actually happened. What do you think? Was it the work of one person, or were several murderers acting all over the country at the same time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, click on the notifications bell so you never miss a new video.